Welcome to the Faithless Father channel, where you gain insight on religion and philosophy. There were messiahs before Jesus. There were messiahs after Jesus.
Wait, Jesus wasn't the only messiah?
No, Jesus was not the only messiah. This video talks about one messiah figure before Jesus, Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean is the second messiah figure we will discuss in this series, which reviews all messiah figures before Jesus of Nazareth. I will be making separate videos regarding the definition of messiah, its historical uses, and rationale behind the identification of all of these men being messiah figures. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on those videos. But the purpose of this video is not to defend or explain the idea that Judas was a messiah, but rather to describe who the man was, detail his behavior and ideas, and provide the primary source text from which this information derives. So there is no confusion. I will point out that there were two different men named Judas who were influential leaders among the Jews around the same time. One, Judas ben Hezekiah, or in other words, Judas, son of Hezekiah, of Sepphoris in Galilee, who aspired for kingship circa 4 BCE after the death of King Herod, and another, Judas the Galilean, founder of the fourth philosophy, also referred to as Judas of Gamala and a Gaulonite, who rebelled against Rome when Quirinius conducted the census in 6 CE. This video will cover the notable history of the latter Judas, the Galilean and Gaulonite, founder of the fourth philosophy, who organized a rebellion in 6 CE. I note this distinction because I don't want you to think I'm missing any details about these men, but also because some great scholars have mistakenly conflated these two men as one. I will be making a dedicated video with the sole aim of explaining why some scholars think these two Judases are identical, and why other scholars think they're actually distinct. I will also be making a video about the other man and messiah, Judas ben Hezekiah, who rose to power circa 4 BCE. So keep an eye out for those videos in the future. There are a lot of similarities between Judas the Galilean and Jesus of Nazareth. I won't go into the comparison here, but it seems like there are similarities for sure. And also, if you look at the region from which these people come, it seems that there are a number of revolutionaries, a number of leaders among the Jews coming out of Galilee, and you can see that Sepphoris is quite close to Nazareth. And I don't fully understand what went on there, but for some reason we have multiple Jewish leaders fighting in some way for the sovereignty of the Jews against Rome coming out of this region of Galilee, and then specifically from Sepphoris and from Nazareth, which are in quite close proximity. As provided in each Messiah video, here's a comparison of the number of words Josephus wrote about the Messiah figure of the video versus the number of words Josephus wrote about Jesus of Nazareth. According to the most recent English translations of Josephus in the Loeb Classical Library, we find 187 words written about Jesus of Nazareth, including the complete Testimonium Flavianum, which was not, in fact, all written by Josephus. Keep an eye out for that video concerning the Testimonium Flavianum. I've not made it quite yet, but I really want to dig in there and give you all of the scholarly information and rationale behind the dissection of that Testimonium Flavianum, so you understand more about why we think that that was not in fact written all by Josephus, but inserted by Christians later about Jesus. But so the very generous, I would say, 187 words written about Jesus of Nazareth in the most recent translation of the most recent English translation of the Loeb in the Loeb Classical Library, comprising the Testimonium Flavianum. So 187 words there about Jesus of Nazareth. Comparatively, we find 626 words written about Judas the Galilean, which means Josephus wrote over 3 times as much about Judas the Galilean than Jesus of Nazareth. This gives you an idea of how significant Judas the Galilean was to Josephus, who is our best source for the events in first century Palestine. Though Josephus cannot be trusted entirely, we read Judas was so influential a leader that he began an entire 4th sect of Judaism in the late Second Temple period. And according to Josephus, this sect played a large role in the conquest of the Jews. In 6 CE, Rome began to rule directly in Palestine. Procurator Coponius was placed as governor over the newly formed Roman province in Judea. And it was at this time that the governor of Syria was tasked to conduct a census there of the Jews and their possessions so they could be taxed appropriately. This is when Judas the Galilean began to proclaim his 4th philosophy and organize his rebellion against the census and therefore against Rome. He prophesied of divine support for his calling, saying heaven would be their zealous helper to no lesser end than the furthering of their enterprise until it succeeded. He said that the assessment carried with it a status amounting to downright slavery, and that the people would be cowards for consenting to pay tribute to the Romans and tolerating mortal masters after having God for their Lord. The scholar Richard Horsley outlines the 3 principal tenets of the 4th philosophy as 1. Jewish freedom, first and foremost. 2. God himself being the singular leader of the Jews. And 3. Personal responsibility to claim freedom by their own actions. And that is found in The Spiral of Violence by Richard Horsley, pages 82 through 85. And I'll put a bibliography down below in the description. There you can find all the sources for the information here. But if you really want to get a grasp of the revolutionary activity of the Jews in this time, and you want to further grasp the actions and ideas of these different Messiah figures, you need to read a few books. These are 2 really good books that you should read. This one is kind of like a hallmark study by Martin Hengel, called The Zealots. It was first written in German, then translated, but luckily we have an English copy, so I don't have to learn German as well. And then also Jesus and the Spiral of Violence. This is written by Richard Horsley, and it details a lot of the different behavior of the Messiah figures, and also the socio-historical context in which we find these Messiah figures and what led to their actions. So really good read. Check those out, as well as Josephus, obviously. But that's why we have this video, so you don't have to buy these books if you don't want to. And then I'm obviously not going to read you all of these books or a lot of that text, because that would make this video very lengthy. But I will provide you the primary source text for all the information that we have about Judas the Galilean, because frankly there's not that much of it. So I can put it all in one video, basically. That'll be coming up here shortly. Though not an exceptional source for information about Judas, we do hear about him from the church father Origen, a scholar and theologian who grew up in the late 2nd century. In his homilies on the Gospel of Luke, which was written somewhere between 233 to 244 CE, we read, quote, "Paul wanted no one to think more of him than he saw, or going beyond the limits of honor to say what had been said about John, that he was the Christ." Christ being the English translation of the Greek Christos, which is the translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, which means Messiah, which technically means the anointed one. So Origen is saying that Paul didn't want anyone to think that he was a Messiah, like some people thought John the Baptist was. And he goes on to say, some people even said this about Josephus, the heresiarch of the Samaritans. Others said it also about Judas the Galilean, unquote. And that's in Homilies on the Gospel of Luke, page 106. It is possible Origen only said Judas the Galilean was called the Christ or in other words, the Messiah, due to what he read in Acts about Judas. But we don't know that is the case. He may have had another source unknown to us, or a few different sources. We don't know. It's a shame that he doesn't tell us his source. Now moving on to the more primary sources. The primary sources for the history of Judas the Galilean are two authors who wrote about him in three different texts. Jewish War, written by Josephus, sometime between 75 to 79 CE. Acts of the Apostles, written about 80 CE, and Antiquities, which was also written by Josephus, circa 93 CE. So starting from the top, from our earliest source, Jewish War, we read, quote, "The territory of Archelaus was now reduced to a province, and Coponius, a Roman of the equestrian order, was sent out as procurator, entrusted by Augustus with full powers, including the infliction of capital punishment. Under his administration, a Galilean named Judas incited his countrymen to revolt, upbraiding them as cowards for consenting to pay tribute to the Romans and tolerating mortal masters, after having God for their Lord. This man was a sophist who founded a sect of his own, having nothing in common with the others." And this is in Josephus' War, Book 2, Chapter 8, Verse 1, in the translation by Thackeray in the Loeb Classical Library. And then when writing about another Messiah figure named Menachem, who is actually the son of Judas the Galilean, he gives us a little information about Judas the Galilean as well. In Jewish War, we read, quote, "At this period, a certain Menachem, son of Judas, surnamed the Galilean, that redoubtable doctor who in old days under Quirinius had upbraided the Jews for recognizing the Romans as masters when they already had God, took his inmate friends with him off to Masada." And that's in Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 17, Verse 8, in the translation by Thackeray as well. A different reading of that verse is actually found in Hengel's Zealots, which I haven't quite figured out yet. I'll give you the reading in Zealots. It reads, "At this period, a certain Menachem, son of Judas, the so-called Galilean, a violent leader of the people who under Cyrenius once reviled the Jews because they were also subject to the Romans." So in that reading, Judas the Galilean is specifically called violent, which is not found in the translation that I have. And this is the only place I can actually find that. I think some more textual criticism needs to be done on my part to fully understand the discrepancy there. And finally, from Jewish War, we read, referring to a man named Eleazar, that, quote, "He was a descendant of the Judas who, as we have previously stated, induced multitudes of Jews to refuse to enroll themselves when Quirinius was sent as censor to Judea." And that's in Book 7, Chapter 8, Verse 1 of Jewish War. In the next source, Acts of the Apostles, we read the account of the Sanhedrin comparing Jesus and the apostles to other Messiah movements that came before them, which were those of Theudas and Judas the Galilean. After considering the probability that these apostles might come to the same end as previous Messiah movements, they only flogged them instead of killing them. Then they were let go. After the apostles told them why they were preaching, we read the response of the Sanhedrin. Quote, "When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And he said to them, 'Men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them.'" And that's in Acts chapter 5, verses 33 through 39. In the final primary source, Antiquities, Josephus wrote, quote, "But a certain Judas, a Gaulonite from a city named Gamala, who had enlisted the aid of Zadok, a Pharisee, threw himself into the cause of rebellion. They said that the assessment carried with it a status amounting to downright slavery, no less, and appealed the nation to make a bid for independence. They urged that in the case of success, the Jews would have laid the foundation of prosperity, while if they failed to obtain any such boon, they would win the honor and renown for their lofty aim, and that heaven would be their zealous helper to no lesser end than the furthering of their enterprise until it succeeded. All the more if with high devotion in their hearts they stood firm and did not shrink from the bloodshed that might be necessary. Since the populace, when they heard their appeals, responded gladly, the plot to strike boldly made serious progress. And so these men sowed the seed of every kind of misery, which so afflicted the nation that words are inadequate. They sowed the seed from which sprang strife between factions and the slaughter of fellow citizens. In this case, certainly, Judas and Zadok started among us an intrusive fourth school of philosophy. And when they had won an abundance of devotees, they filled the whole politic immediately with tumult, also planting the seeds of those troubles which subsequently overlook it, all because of the novelty of this hitherto unknown philosophy that I shall now describe. My reason for giving this brief account of it is chiefly that the zeal which Judas and Zadok inspired in the younger element meant the ruin of our cause. And that's in Antiquities, book 18, chapter 1, verse 1. And that's in the translation in the Loeb Classical Library by Feldman. Josephus continues in another verse, quote, "As for the fourth of the philosophies, Judas the Galilean set himself up as the leader of it. This school agrees in all other respects with the opinions of the Pharisees, except that they have a passion for liberty that is almost unconquerable, since they are convinced that God alone is their leader and master. They think little of submitting to death in unusual forms and permitting vengeance to fall on kinsmen and friends, if only they may avoid calling any man master. Inasmuch as most people have seen the steadfastness of their resolution amid such circumstances, I may forego any further account. For I have no fear that anything reported of them will be considered incredible. The danger is rather that report may minimize the indifference with which they accept the grinding misery of pain." And that's also in book 18, chapter 1, verse 6, in the same translation. And lastly, from Antiquities, we read, quote, "Besides this, James and Simon, the sons of Judas the Galilean, were brought up for trial, and at the order of Alexander were crucified. This was the Judas who, as I have explained above, had aroused the people to revolt against the Romans while Quirinius was taking the census in Judea." That is found in Antiquities, book 20, chapter 5, verse 2. And that is the primary source material from which all the information we have about Judas the Galilean derives. So there you have it. If you do wish to read this on your own, I will put a link to the open source translations of Josephus for you, and then I'll also cite the books and stuff. So you can go to those links and you can read this account for free, all of this material for free. You don't have to buy any books to read Josephus. You will get like an older translation, most likely, but it's all good. I mean, you're still getting the book. You're still getting the text. Very interesting stuff indeed. Make sure to like and subscribe and share to anyone who might be interested in these different revolutionaries, these different Jewish freedom fighters that we find in this era. Anyway, thanks again for watching the video, and we will see you next time.